Hi, I'm Beth Goodnight, landscape designer and gardening coach, retired, and master gardener since 2006. And I will be talking today about successful landscaping. I'm going to talk about some of the concepts that you, the homeowner, gardener, might consider embracing that can help ensure a successful outcome in your ornamental landscape. And as the title says, I will be talking about ornamental gardening, not food gardening. Some of the concepts are transferable knowledge, but some are not. I'll be talking mostly about concepts, not specific details. It would be absolutely impossible for me to teach you everything you need to know to be effective in your ornamental garden in just the hour or so that I have to speak today. So my goal is to give you general guidance. Your own study and research as you take classes and learn by doing will provide you with the specific details you can use to create your own landscape. I call my approach successful landscaping because though a landscape may be pretty, it might not necessarily be successful. To me, success has as much to do with the gardener, the homeowner, as it does with the actual garden. In my mind, elements of a successful landscape are it's pretty, or at least you like it. It has usable spaces that you actually use and where most plants live most of the time. It brings you delight. It fits how much time and effort you want to expend upon it, and it fits your budget. I think many people become discouraged with their landscapes because they initially embrace a look or design without understanding what it takes to actually have a landscape. Is the design right for their property and for their needs? Does it fit their gardening skill level and their tolerance to do necessary maintenance? Can they afford their dream? In the first part of my talk today, I will speak about what you can do to ensure success in your ornamental garden. So let's get started. Number one, we can fully embrace the words of my first favorite rock star, Mick Jagger. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. So what on earth do these lyrics mean in relation to our landscape? Well, for me, it's referring to the difference between fantasy and reality. It is fantasy to want something that simply can't happen. Fantasies about gardening almost always fail. Being realistic about what is actually possible and what you can actually afford is much more sensible. And believe me, don't think it's just a matter of money. All the money in the world won't make a Zone 10 plant make it through a Zone 6 winter out there in the landscape. Number two, planning. Do lots and lots of planning, which includes research and study. Number three, design and plant selection. Good design is a good thing. Good plant selection is an absolute necessity. Number four, culture and maintenance. Do you have the knowledge, skills, and time to do essential culture and necessary maintenance for your landscape? Or do you have the money to have someone else do it for you? Number five, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. It's always going to be easier and less expensive to work with Mother Nature. And apparent miracles out there in your landscape often require extremes involving time, money, and patience. So let's review the things that we can do to ensure a successful landscape. We can have realistic goals and expectations. We can do planning, study, and research. We can do good design and great plant selection. We can do good culture and maintenance. And we can respect Mother Nature. this is going to be easy, right? Well, no, of course it's not going to be easy. If it were going to be easy, you would be out there doing the right thing, knowing what to do, and not sitting here listening to me yammer on in this lecture today. But you can make a good start at success by following these guidelines. And there are lots of other resources out in the community to help you along. There's coaching and landscape design and classes and books. Here are 4 books that I like to recommend that I think every gardener should have in their arsenal of resources. First one, upper left, the blue book is Anne Lovejoy's Handbook to Northwest Gardening. And that is a great book. Anne Lovejoy is the Pacific Northwest gardening guru goddess person. She's wonderful. She's written many books, and I particularly like this one because it's really centered on natural, sustainable, and organic, and those are all good things, and I highly recommend this book. The next book, upper right, is the Sunset Western Garden Book, and it has been a staple for many, many years now. It's really written more like an encyclopedia. It does have tips on gardening, but basically it has information about pretty much any plant you would ever want to plant and learn about. Lower right is Teeming with Microbes, A Gardener's Guide to the Soil Food Web. This is a great, great book about soil. Basically everything a gardener would need to know to understand why soil is so important and how to create good soil for your plants. I read it the first time and it pretty much blew my mind and it had me reeling with all the things I had learned. And so a couple of weeks later, I read it again and I got even more out of it. It's just a really wonderful resource. And the last book, the orange book, is Cass Turnbull's Guide to Pruning. And this is a really wonderful pruning guide. It might not be the critic's choice of pruning guides, but Cass Turnbull makes pruning easy and fun. She has a really nice way of showing you how to identify certain classes of plants that grow in a similar fashion, that those classes of plants get pruned in a similar way. And she teaches you how to recognize the characteristics of each class of plants, and so that you would understand just by looking at the plant how it ought to be pruned. Really, really great book. I do believe this orange version is the most recent edition. And all of these books were at the library, so you can find lots of good information just by the library. All right, here we see Mr. Frog striking a contemplative pose as he gazes upon his garden. He is thinking, "My plant lovelies, what do you need?" So we've taken a quick look at some of the general factors that can help you ensure a successful landscape, and they're all important. So for the rest of today's presentation, I want to talk to you about what plants need. Understanding what plants need can help you decide what type of landscape is best for you, your location, and your situation. So let's learn a few things about what plants need. Okay, what do plants need? Well, they need culture and maintenance. Culture would be the conditions plants need to thrive, like appropriate soil and adequate water and the right sun exposure. And maintenance would be the ongoing work that you would have to do to support the plant's culture needs, making sure it has enough water and you put it in the right location that's not being too shaded too much now that your trees have grown up, etc., things like that. And we're going to start with culture. So culture involves the knowledge of planting zones, soil, plant nutrition, compost and mulch, moisture control, sun exposure, size and space, and a concept we call right plant, right place. Let's start with planting zones. So this is I think the most recent zone map that has been published, and it can be found online at the URL you see above. Do we all know our planting zone? Well, if you don't, you could go to the website there and plug in your zip code and it will tell you your planting zone. And by the way, you don't need to write down that planting zone the URL on the last page of this presentation. There will be a list of several URLs of things that I'll refer to during the course of this talk. Okay, so this zone designation is a hardiness zone, and hardiness refers to cold tolerance. The lower the zone number, the more cold a plant can take before it's killed by the cold. In general, here in Clark County, we're zone 8. If you lived closer to the river or deep into the city, perhaps you would be zone 9. Maybe if you have southern exposure deep in the city, you would have zone 9. And at higher elevation outside of town, more towards the Cascades, you would probably be zone 7 or even 6, or if you get up higher, you might even be zone 5. So knowing your zone will help with plant selection, and plant selection helps with design decisions, what is going to be appropriate for your landscape. Okay, moving on to soil. To support plants' needs, soil contains 4 things: inorganic minerals, inorganic minerals, about 45% by volume, organic matter, about 5% by volume, that would be compost, and both air and water, 25% each by volume. And you can see by how the slide here that it really takes very little organic matter to make plants happy. And this is pretty much what ordinary topsoil would contain, these ratios here. There are many tests available that can tell you a multitude of things about your soil. And there certainly is a lot to know, as you will see by reading the Teeming with Microbes books. But is testing something you absolutely need to do when planting your ornamental garden? Well, the short answer is it depends. Most plants one would put in an ornamental bed would be pretty tolerant of most garden soils, so long as those soils are well draining and the plants are otherwise well cared for. If you aren't sure if you have well draining soil, you could do a soil texture test, which would tell you if your soil is dense or light, water retentive or not. And knowing just these things can aid in plant selection. So the soil texture test basically is what tells you how much clay and silt and sand is in your soil, the mineral content of your soils. And basically, if you had clay soil, that would be considered dense. And if you had sandy soil, that would be considered light and well draining. A soil chemistry test won't be of an awful lot of help for most ornamental gardens in most situations, though knowing soil pH can be helpful, but generally, ornamental plants aren't really terribly fussy about pH. Some can, yes, there are always exceptions, but in general, most ornamental garden plants aren't terribly fussy. And just know that soil chemistry testing is essential for food gardens. And we're not going to talk about food gardens today, but just understand that chemistry testing for food gardens should be done, well, I think every year. Every spring, you ought to know how your soil is doing. Soil testing can also tell you if your soil is in need of amendments. The texture test can give you a good indication if compost is needed to improve drainage, and the chemistry test can tell you if the soil requires additional nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the NPK that you see on fertilizer packages, and also even more obscure trace elements found in the soil. But most ornamental beds don't usually need much in the way of soil amendments. And of course, again, there are always some exceptions just to keep things interesting. However, some types of plants almost always require soil amendments, and vegetables are one of them, as I just mentioned. So these types of plants you see pictured here do need soil amendments. A lot of times they need a lot of soil amendments. Now, they would be vegetables, turfgrass lawns, annuals, and containerized plants. And also sometimes if your soil has been contaminated in some way, which could be chemical spill, overuse of pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, construction site weirdness, all sorts of things can happen. And you don't see it very often, but you do see it happen every now and then. So I'm not going to talk about food gardening today. My focus is on identifying what we can do to help ensure success in the ornamental garden. So I do have a few things to say, however, back on the soil topic. And right now, let's talk a little bit about compost and mulch. A very important concept about using compost and mulch is that compost goes into the soil and mulch goes on top of the soil. Or if you must, compost goes on top of the soil and then is covered up with mulch. And really, I much prefer compost incorporated into the soil than just the layer below the mulch. It will eventually do the same thing, but I think you get better results incorporating the compost into the first, say, 4 or 6 inches of the soil. And remember, from the first soil slide, plants only require a very small amount of compost. A little really does go a long way. Feed the soil so it can feed the plants. It's a saying you'll hear quite often about gardening. This is Mother Nature's way of providing plants with necessary nutrition. When was the last time you went out into a forest and saw someone adding amendments to the forest soil or mulching out there? No one has to do these things because Mother Nature designed plants to respond to the seasons in ways that would help them provide to the soil what is required for their own needs. And basically, if we can see that this works in nature, we can be assured that it will also work in our ornamental landscapes. But how do we feed the soil? Well, in a nutshell, we can use a high carbon mulch like wood chips, bark, or fall leaves. And placing such mulch on top of the soil of our landscape beds allows nature, Mother Nature, to utilize the nitrogen cycle and the soil food web to make great soil. And you can learn a lot about the nitrogen cycle and the soil web or the soil food web in that Teaming with Microbes book. So think of this as Mother Nature helping you do less work and spend less money. So using mulch is nature's way of making compost. Compost is most useful for us in the ornamental beds as a soil conditioner. It helps overly porous soils retain moisture and overly dense soils to drain better. It helps create air pockets so that plants' roots can breathe, and the nitrogen contained in compost is released slowly, and so it can feed the plants better over time rather than just a hit of fertilizer when you choose to spray it on. And usually it's a liquid that you would put on, and this way the compost releases the nitrogen very slowly when the plants are ready to absorb it. All these things are what makes compost great for soil. But again, remember that a little bit of compost goes a long way. And keeping mulch on top of the soil enables the nitrogen cycle and the soil food web to make plenty of compost to feed your plants. Of course, you can always incorporate compost into the soil when you first build your brand new beds, or if there's evidence the plants aren't doing that well in an existing bed with just the mulch on top, you could pull back the mulch and apply a thin layer of compost. And I wouldn't till it in too much because then you're going to be disturbing roots. Tilling it in is really only good before you plant your plants. And then, of course, recover your bed with mulch. Otherwise, let Mother Nature do the work of making compost by just keeping mulch on top of the soil. Okay, let's move on to moisture control. It's all about the flow and the retention. So of course you can install irrigation in really most any landscape, and we're going to talk a little bit more about irrigation in the maintenance section. But for ornamental beds, here are some of the things that can be done to avoid the need for too much added water that would be irrigation, other than what Mother Nature supplies. You could create water retentive soil by keeping a thick layer of high carbon mulch on top of the soil. You could choose plants that are zone appropriate, right plant, right place appropriate. We were going to talk about that in a minute, and ones that are drought tolerant. You can orchestrate a garden design that enables plants to eventually cover the earth completely, which also helps with weed prevention. Don't clean up those leaves and blossoms that the plants shed. This is nature's mulch, which turns into compost, which puts nutrients into the soil, which feeds your plants. You can utilize woody plants. They usually require less water than do most perennials and annual plants, and they make mulch in the form of fall leaves. So for this type of ornamental garden design, you would need to water deeply and infrequently. But what about lawns? They're part of the landscape, and we all know lawns need lots of water, right? So for moisture control on turfgrass lawn, it can be more demanding than for ornamental garden beds. And so we need to, again, create great soil, and we also need to fertilize regularly, mow high, preferably with a mulching mower, and we need to water frequently because roots are closer to the surface. So for turfgrass lawn, we need to water less deeply and more frequently. Yep, you heard that right. Irrigating lawn grass is not done the same as for ornamental garden beds. The reason is that many plants make roots in proportion to how much top growth, that's the foliage that they have at any point in time, and sort of vice versa. Since we mow turf grass short for our lawns, the roots are constantly kept shorter and nearer the surface. They're regenerating all the time, and they grow perhaps 2 to 6 or maybe 8 inches below the surface. This is much more shallow than most woody plants and perennials root. So unless you let your lawn grass grow quite long, most turf grass varieties just don't make deep roots, at least not nearly as deep as perennials. So they need to be watered more frequently simply because the roots stay closer to the surface where there is more moisture loss due to evaporation. What we have to consider is what the words frequent and infrequent really mean to a wide range of plants and their culture needs. For an ornamental garden, I'd say infrequently might be every 2 or 3 weeks, or perhaps longer once the plants are mature and if a good layer of mulch is maintained. And the water might need to reach a depth of 12 inches or more. So yes, for an ornamental garden bed, water deeply and infrequently. But for lawn, infrequent might mean weekly, and that's only if the grass species is known to be drought tolerant and the lawn is mowed at 4 inches or higher. The water only needs to penetrate perhaps 2 to 6 or 8 inches, depending on, again, the grass species and the mowing height. So watering deep for lawn grass is not as deep, and infrequent for lawn grass is much more frequently than for woody plants and ornamentals. These irrigation differences are an example of the need to understand the different types of plants in your landscape and their individual culture needs. It's also an example of how trying to make things simple can often result in confusion. I've really always been a bit concerned about the general mandate to water your landscape deeply and infrequently. It's just not true for every single plant in every single location in your entire landscape. And this difference between lawn grass and woody plants that would be in your ornamental bed illustrates my point. At least I hope it does. Okay, sun exposure. For most plants, sunlight is necessary for photosynthesis. I think we know this. Sun exposure, which is how much sunlight the plant gets, affects foliage coloration, bloom, or lack thereof, and overall size and or shape of the entire plant. So here we have both of these pictures are golden oregano, and the bottom photo is the oregano grown in more sun, and the darker green is the plant grown in less sun. And both of these photos are actually the same plant. It's just that the dark green is the plant as it's creeped underneath the deck. It doesn't get much sunlight there, but you can see it's growing just fine. It's just that it's a dark color. And you can also see at the bottom of the photo where the leaves, the yellow leaves are bleached to kind of a buff, creamy white color. Well, that would be kind of sunburn where it's getting too much sun. So it's very interesting how sun can change the coloration of plants. And ordinarily we think of plants losing their coloration in the shade. Very many plants are lighter colored and darker colored in the lighter colored in the shade and darker colored in the full sun. And this is an example of just the opposite. And here we see how sunlight can affect the plant's growth habit. So both of these plants are evergreen huckleberry. The upper photo is huckleberry grown in a sunnier exposure where it can grow to be about 4 feet tall and 6 feet wide. And this is unpruned. This is completely unpruned. That's about how big they get just all by themselves. Whereas the lower photo is the same plant grown in a shadier forest understory situation. And in these locations, evergreen huckleberry can be 8 to 12 feet tall and perhaps 2 to 3 feet wide. So a much different shape. It's reaching for the sunlight, but yet it still grows and produces fruit in both locations. And the last slide segues nicely into the topic of size and space. Plants come in such an array of sizes and shapes. They are so cute at the nurseries. Baby plants are cute. And the nurseries arrange them into the most compelling compositions. But don't be fooled by the cuteness and marketing factors. It's always good to do research about the plants you think you want before you buy them. I have a habit of shopping with my camera before using my wallet. And I go to the nursery and take some photos of the things that I'm attracted to. And then I go home and I do some research about how large the plants are going to be when they're all grown up and perhaps how fast they're going to grow. And also maybe some research about what's going to look good with the plants that I'm seeing in my pictures. So look at the bottom left-hand photo. There's 4 different plants here, and each one of them is a different shade of green and a different leaf size and shape. And you can see how planting things that are very different one from the other makes a really nice textural effect. So here is an example of why we should learn about plants before buying them, referring to understanding a plant's size and shape at maturity. So both of these photos are, again, the same plant. It's Atlas Weeping Cedar, and the upper photo is a baby. It's probably 3 to 4 feet tall and maybe 2 to 3 feet wide. The lower plant is perhaps 30 feet, and you can see it grows sideways along the ground. It's weeping. It kind of lays down. The cute baby plant above is going to grow into that monster plant below if you'll let it. And what do you think you could do to prevent the monster from happening below? Well, it's something we call pruning, and you would have to do a lot of it every year to keep this cute baby plant from being the monster below. And of course, if you like and want the monster, you would just need to make space for it. And in which case, in, I don't know, 20 years, the baby plant will become the big plant, and it could be a happy thing. But again, it's really good to understand what your plants are going to do when they're all grown up so that you can allocate the right amount of space to suit your plant. And the last aspect of culture that I want to mention today is a concept called right plant, right place. It's a guiding principle that you're going to hear repeated over and over again, and it can have subtly different meanings depending on who's talking about it. To me, it's more than just planting the appropriate plant in the appropriate location. Here's my definition. Right plant, right place is respecting a plant's culture needs for soil, moisture, exposure, planting zone, space needs, etc. It's selecting plants that are native or zone appropriate and non-invasive. It's respecting Mother Nature, and it's being realistic about your commitment to do maintenance. All of your expectations, but especially your commitment to doing the maintenance. And I believe right plant, right place is also includes being a considerate neighbor. We're all packed so tightly into urban and suburban areas these days. We don't need more attention in our lives. So this photo is of English ivy growing through a chain link fence at a rental house that I used to live in. And the owner loved the ivy. She just loved it. But she didn't prevent it from coming over to my side, thus forcing me, and yeah, in my mind, forcing me to either let it overtake my yard, and there was no yard maintenance, so I would have to do the work myself, or prune it several times a year, which I had to do the 3 years I lived here. And I don't know, but it just doesn't seem very neighborly to me. So be a considerate neighbor. Choose plants that are right plant, right place appropriate, non-invasive, and agreed upon if shared. And this last element is something that I discovered in my design practice. And basically, I would hesitate from planting a shade tree on or near the border between two residential homes. The reason why is because if you put your shade tree there, you're going to be causing half of the shade to go to your neighbor. Well, what happens if the only place your neighbor has to grow food is right there where you're going to create shade and make it impossible for them to grow food? That just doesn't seem awfully neighborly to me. So in cases like that, I usually recommend the person who wants a shade tree to choose a smaller tree and put it farther inside the perimeter of their yard, closer to where they will be sitting and wanting their shade, and enjoy the shade for theirself and not force their shade onto someone else. Okay, so ends my section on plant culture. In other words, what plants need. Now we're going to move on and talk about maintenance. That is what you will have to do to make sure your plants get what they need. Maintenance involves planting and fertilizing, weeding, pruning, deadheading, watering, repotting, dividing, mowing. And yeah, did I mention weeding? Yeah, all those things. These things don't sound like all that much fun, but sometimes in order to embrace something that maybe we don't like, we just need a bit of an attitude adjustment. I find doing the maintenance of gardening gives me a chance to commune with nature, nurture living things, get smarter, get some exercise. I've always maintained that gardeners don't need gym memberships. I find doing this work is invigorating, mind expanding, and immensely rewarding. Remember, doing good culture and maintenance is an essential part of ensuring a successful landscape. Being realistic about your tolerance for doing this maintenance, which is another essential of success, is also very important. Let's look at some of the things you're going to have to deal with in doing maintenance in your landscape and find out just how much fun we're going to have. So when we're contemplating what sort of landscape we want for our yard, I'm talking about design, we have to ask ourselves some things like, do I have the knowledge, skills, and time to do the proper maintenance on whatever it is that I want to have in my yard? And if not, am I willing to learn these things? Or can I afford to have this maintenance done for me? Remember, fantasy versus reality? Design and style can affect maintenance. Lots of people say they want an English or cottage garden like the one you see here. And they are really pretty, but generally they're composed of almost exclusively perennial flowers and some hedge-like shrubs such as boxwood. Not that there is anything at all wrong with those things, but it's good to understand that the type of plant affects a garden's level of maintenance. And perennials almost always require the most work. Trees and shrubs almost always require less work. Considering how much time you have for doing maintenance might shift your opinion regarding what sort of design is right for you and your situation. And how about turfgrass lawn? It's becoming a contentious topic in recent years. To lawn or not to lawn? That seems to be the question. And most residential homes have at least some lawn, and some neighborhoods actually require a certain amount of well-maintained lawn. But some people are bucking the perfect lawn trend, and I would say this is a pretty darn perfect looking lawn, and they're opting for lawn-free landscapes, and we're going to look at a couple of those lawn-free solutions in just a bit here. But regarding lawn, what does it take to maintain a turfgrass lawn? Well, you need to keep it well watered, mow high, preferably with a mulching mower, apply organic fertilizer if those clippings aren't adequate, the clippings from the mulching mower. Add lime if the pH is too low, aerate yearly, and sometimes it's beneficial to add sharp gravel to help improve drainage. Most people think all of this sounds like a lot of work, but if you had a very small yard, perhaps it wouldn't be so bad. And there are some types of turf grass that actually require less maintenance than others do. And if you're willing to tolerate a less than perfect lawn, maintenance is often easier. A while back, as I was preparing an earlier version of this talk, this magazine came to my home, and the cover photo is referring to a story about renting villas in Italy. Yeehaw, let's go. But as I looked deep into this photo, I noticed something. Do you see it? What's wrong with this photo? Clover. There's clover in the lawn. Yes, indeed. Clover marring the lawn of this beautiful villa. Who would want to go there? But clover is good. It adds nitrogen to the soil. It's evergreen in the Pacific Northwest, and bees love it. So, okay, some of you might be thinking, but that is a perfectly great looking lawn, and I like clover. And I would say, I agree, it's a beautiful lawn, and I like clover too. Well, I can't tell you how many times in my design practice people have asked specifically how to keep clover out of their lawns. I can't tell you a percentage, but a lot of people who own lawn want it unmarred by anything that is not the species of turf grass they had originally planted in the first place. It sounds crazy, but there are people like that that want this perfect lawn and think that clover is bad. And I've literally seen people laying on their lawns with a paring knife, digging out tiny weeds, including clover. Yeah, crazy. This photo shows an example of what I would consider a less than perfect lawn. And it's perfectly good to me, but people would call it less than perfect. So if it bothers someone, again, perhaps a shift in attitude can enable them to tolerate some clover in their lawns or some other cute flowering plants that are generally considered weeds. But many of these weeds make really cute, beautiful flowers. And who doesn't like flowers? After all, I'm guessing that a lot of us got into gardening because of flowers. I know that's what got me into gardening, flowers. So bring on the clover. When is less more? An age-old question. Shown here are a couple examples of non-traditional landscape solutions employing either no lawn or wild lawn, otherwise known as meadow. And these are alternatives to turf grass, and they can require either more or less work. So I just want to tell you a quick story about the upper photo. It was in a neighborhood that I lived in Vancouver, and I walked by one day when the gentleman who owned the house was out there tending his garden. And I said, "Oh, I love your new no lawn landscape. You know, how are you liking it?" And he said, "Well, I hate it." And I was kind of shocked. I was, well, very shocked. And he said, "Really, it's so much more work than just growing or mowing the lawn." Okay. I had to kind of stop and think. So it's a tiny, tiny lot. It probably took him all of 10 minutes to get his mower out, do the mowing deed, and put his mower away. And sure, that probably seems like not very much work. To irrigate, he probably pushed the button, or the button was on a timer and it watered itself. So he didn't have to do that either. And, you know, here there's mulch that's exposed, and probably he has to weed that. Weeds do grow in gravel. He'd have to weed that. He has to deadhead the flowers. He has to prune the shrubs. Yeah, I can see how some people would think that was more work than mowing once a week. So, yeah. The lower photo is meadow, and this is a tall grass meadow. It does not have flowers. Some meadows have flowers, some meadows do not. And it would be debatable whether this would be more or less work. So meadows generally have to be mowed just once or twice a year. That sure sounds like less work, except how are you going to mow this? It requires a tractor. Do you have a tractor? I don't have a tractor. Most people in suburban or urban areas don't have tractors. So wild lawn meadow is usually more appropriate for people who have acreage, but it is a great choice to commit some of your acreage instead of mowing it like it's lawn, to leave it as meadow. And as you can see here, there's a pathway mowed through this for walking through your meadow. But meadows are great for habitat. Birds and bees and butterflies and bunnies are all happily live out here in the meadow. And by the way, if you have meadow for your bunnies to live in, they will stay out of your ornamental gardens. Truly, they will. So these are two interesting non-traditional landscape solutions that don't employ turf grass lawn. Okay, let's move on from lawn to another typical maintenance issue that would be weed prevention and the use of weed barrier to prevent the weeds. And shown here, we see the weed barrier is black plastic. And how's that working so far? I think it's not working all that well. I'm seeing moss, and I guess a lot of people would consider moss as weeds. It's something that you don't want there, so I guess it would be a weed. Anyway, landscape fabric and black plastic do not end weeding in the Pacific Northwest. 50% of weed seeds are airborne. That means they cast their weeds to the air and they're carried far and wide on the air current. Some are carried quite far. This is the weeds and just plants in general who do use this strategy. It's a strategy of getting their DNA out there a long ways from, you know, where they grew initially, so as to spread their seed, obviously. And this landscape fabric and black plastic also compromises air and water flow in the soil. Yep, air and water flow. Remember that both air and water are essential parts of healthy soil. Prohibiting air and water flow in the soil renders the soil, well, really more or less sterile and devoid of all the wonderful microbial life that makes the soil healthy and actually good for plants. You might say, but I don't want anything growing in that location anyway. Okay, point taken. But see that black plastic bulge in the photo? It's covering tree roots. Roots are something growing, right? And they don't count. We don't need healthy soil to grow trees. And while we're on the subject of weed barriers, there's something that has been used for a long time as the, quote, environmental choice for preventing weeds: cardboard. Did you know that cardboard may contain chemicals, adhesives, plastics, and other things you might not want in your landscape? Did you know that cardboard used as weed barrier, just as is landscape fabric and black plastic are used, also inhibits migration, a gas migration in the soil, and it prevents air from getting into the soil and the harmful gases created by nature's processes that are in the soil, it prevents them from escaping. So when cardboard gets dry, cardboard that you put in, as a weed barrier, when it gets dry, it gets really, really dry. And when it gets wet, it gets really, really wet. And both of these conditions prevent gas transfer, also water transfer, in and out of the soil, which is not conducive to healthy soil. So let me try to explain a little bit more about using cardboard and weed barrier in the ornamental garden. Weed barrier, even if I don't agree with its use, is generally used to keep new weeds from growing where you don't want them. And for this discussion today, we're talking about ornamental beds, not food beds. So we're talking about new weeds in ornamental beds. Weed barrier would be something you placed on top of the soil that you have planted or will be shortly planting with ornamental plants, after which those beds are topped with mulch. And this weed barrier application is not how cardboard or newspaper, for that matter, should be used in the ornamental landscape. The reason is the fact that cardboard disrupts air and moisture flow in and out of the soil. So what would be an okay use for cardboard and or newspaper in the ornamental landscape? Well, likely many of you have heard people using cardboard and or newspaper to smother lawn grass or weeds as they attempt to create a new landscape or veggie beds. Sure, that works and it is great, but it's an entirely different function than using the cardboard as weed barrier for preventing new weeds on a newly planted bed. There's very good science about mulch and the use of cardboard in the landscape. WSU's Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott has spent the last 20 years or more studying mulch, and she has made presentations on mulch and the use of cardboard, showing the scientific proof of what works and what doesn't. And on that last page of this presentation, you can see the references to the presentation's links, URLs that you can harvest off and go and look at those videos. They're very enlightening. So the bottom line is that we don't want any kind of barrier, not any kind, be it cardboard, newspaper, black plastic, landscape fabric, between the mulch and the soil below the mulch. Because for Mother Nature to make compost out of mulch, the mulch needs to touch the soil. If you need to kill weeds and grass to make way for a new landscape bed, yeah, go ahead and use cardboard or newspaper. And you actually can even use black plastic, but removing it becomes a lot more of a problem. But do regard this cardboard as a temporary measure. Once the weeds and grass below the cardboard are dead, remove the cardboard, or at least break it up into very small pieces. Then do what you would normally do to create good soil for your new bed, incorporating compost if it's necessary, and then plant your plants, and then cover the soil with no barrier, cover the soil with a thick layer of mulch. So, if weed barrier, fabric, plastic, cardboard, newspaper aren't all that kind to soil, what can we do to prevent weeds on our ornamental beds? Mulch. We can use mulch. As I said earlier in this presentation, anything that is high carbon works well as mulch. My personal preference is fall leaves, and it's mostly because they are free and they're readily available. But of course, there are alternatives to fall leaves. You can use bark, but it's gotten to be really expensive in recent years. And that's another reason why I like fall leaves, because they're free. And the science has shown that because bark is waxy, it doesn't readily absorb water. And well-hydrated mulch transports water better down into the soil and facilitates composting where the mulch touches the soil. And it is also less of a fire hazard if you live in a very dry area. The waxiness actually slows nature's composting process, but bark is still good to use as mulch. It's just expensive and you might have to water it a little bit more. I do like wood chips better than bark, and they don't have the same wax problem as bark does because most of the wood is from the interior of the tree, not simply the bark. But in many areas, wood chips are difficult to acquire. And if you do acquire them, you very often have to accept way more than you could possibly use. And this really can be a problem if you have a very small landscape like a townhouse or a condo or yeah, just a very, very tiny yard. So what can be done? You could design your landscape to contain many deciduous trees, shrubs, and perennials, which will provide leaves to cover your ornamental beds each fall with a layer of mulch. Take a cue from nature. Forests are mostly composed of trees, shrubs, and perennials, and so are your ornamental landscape beds. And if leaves are good mulch for forests, then they're good mulch for your ornamental landscape bed as well. But just note, it's best to clean up leaves from off of turfgrass lawn. Just put them on your landscape beds. Another way to help prevent weeds is to plant densely. Mother Nature hates a void. And where there are no plants, do you know what she puts there? Yup, weeds. So cover the earth completely. Okay, we've danced around and up and down and in and out and over the top of the dreaded weeding maintenance topic. I think it's really one of the most hated maintenance chores, and pruning might be the second most hated chore. So in regards to pruning, all woody plants get pruned the same, right? Well, if you said yes, you would be wrong, but that's really how many people prune their woody plants, all the same. Pruning in that fashion is doing a disservice to your plants. Part of the beauty of plants is their diversity and variability. So many plants, so many different looks, and they grow in a fabulous array of sizes, shapes, forms, textures, and colors. If you prune everything into the shape of a lollipop or orb or cube, you're depriving yourself of a truly rich landscape. And of course, that is just my opinion. Yeah, but I'm sticking to it. Many people prune everything the same way because they actually like that look. It can be very contemporary, having just one or two types of plants and pruning everything identical, like a flat lawn and hedge around your perimeter. It's very contemporary. It's not for me, but because I like flowers, but it is good for some people. And other people simply don't have any idea what they're doing. There are so many nuances about doing correct, horticulturally correct pruning. And remember Cass Turnbull's Guide to Pruning book that I mentioned earlier. It can go a long way towards teaching you what you need to do in regard to pruning. And just know that pruning is a maintenance chore, and doing good maintenance helps ensure a successful landscape. Okay, moving on to irrigation by way of container gardens. Irrigation is another subject that many gardeners fear. It's complicated. Well, at least we think it's complicated. Many people think, well, I'm just going to have lawn and oodles of pots and pretty containers and fill them with pretty flowers because that will all just be easier than trying to figure out how to water a regular, in the ground landscape. Well, surprise, container gardens can require more work than regular out there in the garden gardens. Container gardens can require daily watering, actually sometimes more than daily, 2 or 3 or 4 times daily if they're in the hot, full sun. And they require frequent deadheading. That's removing the dead blooms off of the plants so that they can rebloom. And most containers, especially ones that have annual flowers in them, need fresh soil yearly. And potted trees very often needed to be root pruned. Some experts say yearly. I would say it depends on the size of the tree and the species and the size of the container. Certainly every 3 years would be necessary, but every year, not sure about that. Oh yes, let me tell you the sad story of an epic fail container garden that was, yes, mine. I confess it was mine. This container that's dead, the flower or the garden bed behind it, you can see that's in the soil, and the lawn all got similar culture and maintenance, you know, mulch, nutrients, water, sunshine, blah, blah, blah. So what went wrong? Well, water. I guess lack of water is what went wrong. Containers have a small volume of soil compared to out there in the landscape. And in hot temperatures, soil in the container can dry out. And that's not good for plants. And soil can also get hot in containers, and that's also not good for plants. Soil volume is very important in determining how frequently plants need to be watered. Out there in the garden, there's way more soil volume. So generally, those soils are able to retain moisture better than containers do, particularly if they have mulch on them. So in general, what can make a huge difference in soil retention or moisture retention? Mulch. It's good not only for keeping weeds at bay, but also for keeping moisture in the soil. You can apply it to your containers too. But remember, containers still need more frequent irrigation than do garden beds simply because of their small soil volume. And yes, once again, I'm showing fall leaves as mulch. I don't mean to beat you over the head with leaves and promote only leaves as mulch, because truly I do like wood chips better. If you can get wood chips, I would prefer those, but I'm cheap. And sometimes when you're on a real shoestring budget, leaves are just the way to go. There are so many deciduous plants that shed their leaves in the fall. They provide free mulch if you'll just use it. It's such an underused resource. And have I mentioned it's free? However, there are some leaves that don't really work that well as mulch. Ones to avoid are thick, leathery ones like some species of magnolia and oak, huge leaves like sycamore, London plane tree, big leaf maple, and ones that have foliar diseases or that tend to have foliar diseases like a lot of fruit trees, cherry or apple. These should be avoided. If you are absolutely positive the fruit tree leaves are yours and you did not have any disease, you could go ahead and use them. But if you're getting fruit trees from some other source, I would just say no. As for the large leaves, you can use them if you put them through a shredder or run your mulching mower over them and bag them and then just stick them on your garden beds. But back to my container debacle here. So I whacked off all the dead foliage and I watered and I watered and I kept watering, and it took, I don't know, 2 weeks or so maybe for the plants to spring back to life. So yeah, lesson learned, I guess. I think I learned a lesson. Container gardens can require more care, or let's just say more diligent care, than out there in the landscape gardens. Okay, in the previous few slides about container gardening, I've danced around the topic of moisture control, otherwise known as irrigation. I'm not going to dwell all that long on the topic of irrigation, more than to present just a few things to consider about irrigation that might help you make decisions about your garden design and plant selection that may affect your overall success in your ornamental landscape. To start, people think they can adequately water their gardens, their ornamental gardens, by hand. It feels like the personal touch. And not that one absolutely cannot water effectively by hand. Sure, it can be done, but it usually takes a lot longer than one would think to get the water down to the levels of the root zone where it's needed. So the question you have to ask is, how much water is needed and how long will it take to deliver the water that's needed? So these photographs are that garden area that's just off the deck of where I had my container fail. And I thought, well, I'm gonna, water the container, so maybe the garden bed could use a drink too. So I got out my hose and stood there for about 10 minutes and watered an area about 4 by 12 feet in size. And note that, what is that mulch? It's fall leaves. Imagine that. Anyhow, I watered for about 10 minutes. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm a little bit bored now. I'm going to see how far the water got into the soil to see if I can stop now. And there I am, the lower photo, pulling back the mulch, and the water only moistened about 1/4 inch deep. It didn't even touch the soil below, so it didn't even get to the roots. So this is the main reason why I say that hand watering is not that effective, because how long are you willing to stand there and water until the water actually gets to where you need to get it? That is the question. So let's talk about some alternatives to hand watering. Some sort of irrigation system often is much more effective on all but the very smallest landscapes. Sure, if you just have one tiny entry garden at the door of your condo, you can do that by hand. You sure can. So here are some options to consider. First one, upper left-hand corner, is hose and sprinkler. The advantages: they're inexpensive and they're really easy to use. They might get you wet, but they're really easy to use. Disadvantaged are they often have uneven watering patterns, and there's overspray onto hard surfaces. It's very hard to tailor the system to avoid things that don't need to be watered. And there's always a loss water loss due to evaporation, just because it's spraying water up into the air. So yeah, you're going to lose some to evaporation. The next choice is above the ground automated, which is basically a sprinkler system installed into your ground that springs up and squirts water into the air around. So the advantage is it's convenient. Yeah, they work by themselves. You just put them on the timer and the timer just says run. The disadvantages are that they tend to be expensive, and they also tend to be wasteful because, again, they overspray. They can be inefficient. They require annual tune-up and maintenance. So on the other column, we have the soaker hose. So the column on the left would be above the ground, squirting water into the air. On the right, we're going to have options that deliver the water right to the soil. So soaker hose advantages: they're inexpensive, they're very efficient, and they actually can be automated. But the disadvantages are that there's an overwatering risk, and there's actually an overwatering risk with all of the automated systems as well. And the reason why is because we're depending on the timer to make the water happen. But depending on, we have a stretch of cool weather, and so the water's not evaporating, and now we're overwatering. Or we have a stretch of really, really hot weather, and now we're not watering enough. So being on automatic isn't necessarily a good thing. Soaker hoses can be damaged by digging. And so because soaker hoses are better to use if they're underneath the mulch where they're touching the soil, and it delivers to the water to the soil better. And are you going to remember exactly where all the lines are? And when you're putting a new plant in, oops, They also, soaker hoses don't perform well on slopes. Placement is essential. They need to be placed around the drip lines of woody plants, and as the plants grow, that needs to be moved. So you're almost constantly, every couple, 2 or 3 years at least, you are changing where those soaker hoses go. And soaker hoses may contain substances like BPA, PVC, and heavy metals. Now, I'm not absolutely positive of that now. I prepared this slide for an earlier version, and at that time, we were starting to see more and more soaker hoses delete those ingredients and become more environmentally friendly. So just check the labels on that. And then finally, automated drip systems advantages. They're very efficient. They're good on slope. They're easy to tailor, and they're almost always made of polyethylene, which doesn't include BPA, PVC, heavy metals. So they're very safe. And disadvantages are they're expensive. And again, there's that overwatering risk. And again, there's risk of damaging the lines by digging, and placement and maintenance are both essential elements to these things. One thing also to be aware of with all watering systems, including watering by hand, is if the soil or mulch is very dry, it can become hydrophobic, afraid of water, hydrophobic. Watering hard, and a lot on very dry soil will cause water to run off and not be absorbed. So if it's been a long while since the last watering and the mulch and soil is very dry, water lightly at first for a short period of time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, until you can see water starting to run off or pool. Then give that area a rest. Go and water 5 or 10 minutes elsewhere and repeat around your landscape. Eventually come back to where you started and water again. Doing this lets the first water absorb into the soil a little bit. And when more water is added a little bit later, it helps move that water, that next application of water, farther down into the soil. So if I have an in-ground irrigation system, I like to set it up first to run each station about 5 minutes. Then I run each station again for maybe about 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. And then I run each station again for maybe 20 minutes or 30 minutes, or just depending on what the soil and plant needs are. And really, once you learn your system, it's pretty easy to deliver the right amount of water. And just remember, it's good to go out there and test, get a moisture meter and see how far the water is going down in there. This watering strategy is particularly useful with drought-tolerant landscapes and ones that have become overly dried out for whatever the reason is. You go on vacation or, something. And it's also good used on lawns. All plants need some water sometimes. So the word tolerant does not equate to like. Just because a plant is drought tolerant doesn't mean it likes the drought. It means it can do okay with drought, but it really would rather have a drink now and then. And also note, when Mother Nature makes it rain, you don't need to irrigate, so save that water. So the best thing that you can do to avoid the pitfalls of irrigation is to plan a landscape that doesn't require that much water in the first place. And for those plants that do require a lot of water, group those with similar needs together. And remember, from the culture section, for ornamental gardens, create great soil, choose appropriate plants, use mulch, cover the earth completely, utilize woody plants, and water deeply and infrequently. And for your turf grass lawn areas, keep them well watered, mow high with the mulching mower, use organic fertilizer as necessary, use lime also as necessary, and aerate yearly, and water your turf grass lawns less deeply and more frequently than you would your ornamental beds. And finally, let Mother Nature help you in your gardening efforts. Remember the factors that help ensure success? Respecting Mother Nature is one of them. She wants to help you. She tries to help you. You just have to recognize a gift as a gift and not discount it. So, how on earth is there a lush lawn growing in the dense shade of this hawthorn tree? So this is the same yard where the ivy was creeping through the fence on the sunny side of the yard. This is the shady side of the yard. And I had just mowed this area and I looked back and I thought, wow, that lawn looks pretty darn good for not doing anything to make it look good. Because remember, this is a rental house. I was not trying that hard. And then I thought to myself, I put my landscape designer hat on and I said, well, we tell people all the time they can't grow lawn grass in the shade. So how on earth is a lush lawn growing here in the dense shade? Well, it's a gift for you. Let Mother Nature help you by embracing the moss that naturally occurs in shady areas in our region. Yes, even when it's in your lawn. If we change our perspective about something that we don't like, we just might be able to see how it can work for us after all. I mean, look at this. It's green. It's actually mulch, and it helps keep the moisture into the soil, which helps the grass to grow. So looking back here, that looks like a perfectly good lawn. What is wrong with having additional green in that lawn? I don't really see anything wrong with it. So do you really want to fight Mother Nature for every little thing you want in your garden if she's working really hard to make it impossible for you? Is battling nature really how you want to spend your time? Okay, let's wrap it up here. Maybe we can try learning about what we think we want, being realistic about what is possible, perhaps changing our vision if necessary, and letting Mother Nature help. If we can follow these guidelines I've laid out today, are observant and patient, then I think everyone can have a successful landscape. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Happy gardening. Here are the links.